The oldest bureaucracy on Earth kept 2 sets of books. One tracked barley and silver with the obsessive precision of accountants who knew miscalculations meant punishment. The other tracked beings called the Anunnaki with exactly the same precision, listing their names, their cities, their administrative territories, their conflicts over water rights and political jurisdiction. The scribes who pressed these records into wet clay 5,000 years ago drew no distinction between the 2 categories. Grain inventories and divine genealogies occupied the same archives, written in the same hand, filed with the same bureaucratic indifference to whether anyone would believe them. Modern scholars read these tablets and face an immediate problem. The records don't behave like mythology. They lack the symbolic layering, the moral frameworks, the archetypal patterns that define religious literature across cultures. But they also don't behave like history, not in any conventional sense, because they document events that violate biological possibility and chronological coherence. They occupy a categorical void we have never successfully named. The Sumerian King List, catalogue number WB444 in the British Museum, represents perhaps the clearest example of this problem. Compiled around 2100 BC, it opens with a statement presented as administrative fact. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists the first ruler, Alulim, and records his reign length with bureaucratic precision, 28,800 years. Not an approximation, not a symbolic gesture toward antiquity, but a specific calculated figure. The second king reigned 36,000 years. The pattern continues through 8 rulers before the text adds, almost as a footnote, then the flood swept over. You're possibly listening to this in the quiet hours, when the outside world has withdrawn and the mind begins sorting through questions it pushed aside during daylight. Wherever you are in bed, in transit, in some darkened room waiting for sleep, you're sharing this moment with others scattered across time zones, all of us staring at the same strange evidence. If you find yourself wanting to return to these questions, a gentle tap on the subscribe button ensures you'll find your way back when the next mystery surfaces. The trouble with the King List isn't merely that it records impossible lifespans. The trouble is how it records them. The same scribal tradition that produced the King List also produced thousands of economic tablets, records of temple grain distributions, labour assignments, tax assessments. Those documents demonstrate obsessive attention to factual accuracy. A scribe who miscounted barley rations faced consequences. The professional culture demanded precision, yet that same culture produced a document claiming the first 8 kings of human civilization reigned for a combined 241,200 years before a flood interrupted the sequence. Then, kingship descended from heaven again, and post-flood rulers reigned for progressively shorter but still impossible periods, 1,200 years, 960 years, 600 years, before the numbers gradually decline into ranges that begin approaching plausible human lifespans. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty of Ur, the reign lengths match archaeological evidence precisely. The document transitions from impossible to verifiable without acknowledging any boundary between the 2 modes. Scholars have proposed various explanations. Perhaps the years weren't solar years, but represented lunar cycles, seasonal markers, or generational counts. Perhaps the numbers encode mathematical relationships rather than temporal measurements. Perhaps scribes inflated ancient lineages to glorify their city's antiquity. Each explanation accounts for some aspect of the problem while creating new difficulties. If the early numbers are symbolic, why do they follow such rigid mathematical patterns? Multiples of 60, the base unit of Sumerian mathematics? Why does every surviving copy preserve identical figures across different cities and time periods? And most troubling, why does no Sumerian text ever explain or contextualize these numbers? The silence around the chronology is more disturbing than the chronology itself. Later, Babylonian scholars who copied these texts added marginal notes to clarify difficult terms and provide context for obscure references. But when they reached the impossible reign lengths, they simply copied them exactly, adding no commentary, no explanation, no indication that anything required justification. The tradition of preserving these numbers intact persisted for over 1500 years across multiple languages and political systems. The Anunnaki appear in this documentary record not as vague cosmic forces, but as named administrators with specific portfolios. Enki governed freshwater resources and held jurisdiction over craftsmanship and what the texts call wisdom. Enlil controlled weather systems and exercised political authority over human settlements. Inanna managed both warfare and love, an unusual combination that suggests functional categories we no longer understand. Ninasag oversaw childbirth and maintained authority over mountainous territories. Each deity possessed defined responsibilities that read more like job descriptions than theological attributes. Temple hymns from the early dynastic period catalogue these assignments with the precision of organisational charts. The hymn to Enlil describes him as the one whose pronouncements cannot be altered, and the one who determines destinies. Language that sounds religious until you notice it appears in texts that also specify which fields belong to his temple complex and which irrigation channels his priests maintain. The administrative and the theological occupy the same documentary space without apparent distinction. This bureaucratic treatment of divine beings appears consistently across genres. Legal codes reference Anunnaki authority as the source of juridical principles. Agricultural manuals attribute irrigation techniques to divine instruction. Ritual texts preserve exact specifications down to precise wording and measurement for ceremonies that priests were taught, not inspired to perform. The relationship between humans and Anunnaki is consistently framed as one of transmission. Humans receive, learn, maintain systems they did not originate. Cylinder seals from the Third Millennium BC reinforce this pattern. They depict gods in architectural settings, temples, administrative buildings, shown reviewing workers, inspecting irrigation projects, receiving reports from human officials. One seal shows Enki with water flowing from his shoulders while standing before a temple structure. Another shows Nana with scribes presenting tablets that appear to be account ledgers. These are not transcendent beings hovering in cosmic space. These are managers conducting inspections. What makes this documentation pattern significant is its contrast with other ancient civilizations. Egyptian gods were cosmic forces who manifested in particular locations but existed fundamentally beyond geography. Greek gods inhabited Olympus, a realm separated from human cities. Norse gods dwelled in Asgard, requiring a literal bridge to access human space. But Sumerian texts place the Anunnaki directly in human cities, not visiting them, not occasionally manifesting there, but residing in them as permanent occupants with property boundaries and territorial jurisdictions. The text described disputes between these beings that read exactly like border conflicts between city-states. The narrative cycle about Inanna and Enki recounts how Inanna travelled to Eridu, manipulated Enki into giving her over 100 me, divine attributes that function like transferable cultural technologies, and transported them to her own city of Uruk. Enki attempts to retrieve the stolen property, sending servants in pursuit. Inanna escapes, and the me remain in her jurisdiction. This is described as theft, prosecuted through what reads like legal procedure. The economic dimension appears in temple archives that track offerings delivered to specific deities with the same itemization used for human officials. Monthly rations of bread, beer and livestock are recorded by recipient. Inanna receives specified amounts. Ninurta receives specified amounts. Dumuzi receives specified amounts. The tablets indicate not just what was delivered, but where within the temple complex, which room, which altar. These documents are delivery receipts. And then there is the phrase that opens the King List and recurs throughout Sumerian political literature. Kingship descended from heaven. Not was established by humans, not emerged from tribal leadership, not developed through social organization. Descended. The verb choice is specific. In Sumerian administrative language, the term indicates physical movement from above downward, the way rain descends, the way objects fall. Political authority is described using spatial vocabulary, as though governance arrived from elsewhere and was installed rather than invented. This creates an immediate question about origins. If Sumerian civilization understood kingship as something that descended, something transferred from non-human to human administration, then what preceded human rule? The texts provide an answer, but it's an answer that archaeology cannot address. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest creation narratives recovered from Mesopotamia, does not begin with humanity. It opens with a division of cosmic territories among Anu, Enlil, Enki, and Ninhursag. Heaven is parcelled out. Earth's surface is assigned. The freshwater abyss beneath the ground receives its administrator. Mountain ranges get their overseer. Only after this territorial allocation does the text mention cities being founded, irrigation channels being dug, divine households being established. Humans appear later in the narrative, almost incidentally, created because the divine administrators were exhausted from maintaining the infrastructure themselves. The Atrahasis Epic makes this sequence even more explicit. The text describes a period when lesser divine beings, called the Igigi, were assigned to dig irrigation canals and maintain urban centres. They performed this labour for what the text indicates were extended periods, growing increasingly resentful of the physical burden. Eventually they revolted, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's temple to demand relief. The solution was not negotiation or reform, it was replacement. Enki proposed creating humans to assume the labour burden, and the goddess Belet Ili mixed clay with the blood of a slain god to form what the text calls Lulu, a term that translates approximately as primitive worker. This reverses the civilizational sequence we assume as foundational. The standard archaeological narrative describes agriculture leading to surplus, surplus enabling specialization, specialization producing urban complexity. Civilization emerges from human innovation through incremental development. But Sumerian texts describe cities existing before humans, irrigation systems functioning before humans, administrative hierarchies operating before humans. The infrastructure precedes the species that will eventually maintain it. The question of who built this infrastructure before human labour was available never receives direct answer in the texts. The cities are presented as existing, already ancient, already functional. Eridu is consistently described as the oldest settlement on Earth, founded by Enki in the beginning, before the distribution of kingship to other urban centres. Archaeological excavations at Eridu have uncovered 17 building levels beneath later Sumerian temples, with the lowest strata dating to approximately 5400 BC, over 2 millennia before the development of writing. But Sumerian texts don't describe Eridu as a human settlement that gradually acquired sacred significance. They describe it as sacred from its foundation, as Enki's administrative centre from the beginning. The hymns reference the city as eternally linked to divine governance, predating human occupation. If this framing reflects some kind of historical memory rather than purely symbolic construction, it suggests the city's significance preceded the culture that recorded it. The same pattern appears in references to other early urban centres. Nippur is described as Enlil's city from its foundation. Uruk is Inanna's territory from the earliest textual references. These aren't gods who adopted existing cities as cult centres. These are cities that exist because particular administrators required them. The relationship flows from divine need to urban construction, not from human settlement to religious association. Temple ritual texts reinforce this priority. They preserve extraordinarily specific instructions for ceremonies, exact wording for prayers, precise measurements for offerings, particular gestures at designated moments. These specifications are described not as traditions that evolved through practice, but as protocols that were taught. The verb forms matter. Humans are instructed, not inspired. They receive detailed training in procedures whose logic is not explained, but whose execution must be exact. The concept of me embeds this transmission framework at the foundational level. The term appears across dozens of texts and refers to what scholars usually translate as divine decrees or fundamental attributes. But neither translation captures the specificity. The me weren't abstract principles, they were discrete, transferable packages of knowledge and capability. Over 100 individual me are catalogued: kingship, priesthood, writing, metalworking, agriculture, music, warfare, truth, judgment, descent to the underworld, ascent from the underworld, and dozens more. Each me is treated as a possession, something that can be held, transferred, or stolen. The narrative cycle about Inanna obtaining the me from Enki describes her travelling to Eridu specifically to acquire these attributes. She didn't develop them through experience or discover them through innovation. She obtained them through successful negotiation and manipulation. Enki possessed them before she did. The me of agriculture existed before any human planted a seed. The me of writing existed before any human pressed a stylus into clay. This framing appears so consistently across Sumerian literature that it represents not merely occasional mythological motif, but foundational assumption about how civilization functions. Knowledge doesn't emerge from human experimentation. It descends from prior sources who possessed it first. Skills aren't invented through trial and error. They're transmitted through instruction from those who already mastered them. Culture isn't built, it's inherited. The Farmer's Instructions, a Sumerian agricultural manual from the Third Millennium BC, opens with the line, "In days of yore a farmer instructed his son." The text then catalogues precise techniques for field preparation, irrigation timing, seed selection, and harvest procedures. But earlier in the composition, it references instructions given by the god Ninurta. The farmer teaching his son is passing down knowledge that was originally taught to humanity, not developed by humanity. The same transmission pattern appears in craft texts. The hymn to the pickaxe credits Enlil with creating the tool and demonstrating its use to humans. The text doesn't describe divine inspiration that led humans to invent the pickaxe. It describes Enlil literally showing humans how to strike the earth, how to angle the blade, how to apply the tool to canal construction. This is technical training, not theological symbolism. Legal codes follow identical framing. The Code of Hammurabi one of the earliest comprehensive legal systems, presents itself as divinely revealed rather than humanly created. The prologue describes how the god Shamash instructed Hammurabi in principles of justice. Whether this represents actual knowledge transmission or merely claims to divine authority for human-created laws cannot be determined from the text alone, but the claim itself reflects an understanding of law as received rather than invented. What's striking about early Mesopotamian legal codes is their completeness. The principles of proportional justice, the frameworks for evidence and testimony, the structures for property rights and contract enforcement, these appear essentially formed in the earliest texts rather than showing gradual development. The Code of Ur-Nammu, from approximately 2100 BC, already contains sophisticated juridical concepts that typically require extended evolution to develop. The pattern suggests either remarkably rapid indigenous development or implementation of legal frameworks that were received from sources that had already refined them. Administrative systems show similar characteristics. The bureaucratic structures governing Sumerian cities demonstrate organizational sophistication that usually emerges through extended trial and error. Record-keeping systems, taxation frameworks, resource allocation mechanisms, these appear in early dynastic texts as functioning systems rather than experimental innovations. The temple archives from Gersu contain economic records, tracking offerings, labour assignments, and trade networks with the complexity of mature administrative operations. If these systems were genuinely invented by early Sumerian administrators through iterative experimentation, we should expect to find simpler, earlier versions, failed attempts, transitional forms showing gradual refinement. Archaeological evidence from other regions developing complex societies shows exactly this kind of progression. But Sumerian administrative texts appear remarkably complete from their earliest attestations, as though implementing templates rather than innovating procedures. The astronomical knowledge embedded in Sumerian texts creates similar chronological problems. The texts demonstrate understanding of planetary movements, stellar positions, and cyclical patterns that require generations of continuous observation to establish. The precision with which they track celestial mechanics suggests data collection spanning centuries, observational programs that would need to be maintained across multiple generations to produce the accuracy documented in the records. The length of year calculations preserved in administrative texts are accurate to modern standards. The tracking of Venus cycles shows precision that European astronomy wouldn't match until telescopic observation. The understanding of lunar phases and eclipse patterns demonstrates mathematical sophistication comparable to much later scientific traditions. This knowledge appears in texts from the early dynastic period, fully formed, with no surviving records of the centuries of observation that would have been necessary to generate it through indigenous development. Sumerian texts attribute this astronomical knowledge to divine instruction, describing how the Anunnaki taught humans to track celestial movements and recognize patterns in the sky. Whether this represents actual knowledge transmission or merely a cultural explanation for capabilities whose true origins were forgotten cannot be determined from the texts. But the claim itself appears consistently enough to suggest it represents more than incidental mythological detail. The pattern repeats across knowledge domains. Metallurgy appears in Mesopotamian. Texts with sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and temperature control that typically requires extensive experimentation to develop. Architectural techniques show engineering knowledge that enables construction of stable, large-scale structures from the earliest urban periods. Medical texts preserve diagnostic procedures and treatment protocols that suggest accumulated practical experience. Yet they attribute this medical knowledge to divine teaching rather than human discovery. What we face in these texts is a civilization that consistently describes itself as receiving rather than inventing its foundational technologies, a culture that frames its own capabilities as inherited from prior sources who possessed the knowledge first, whether this reflects actual transmission from an earlier advanced culture, knowledge preserved from some pre-Sumerian population, or merely a cultural narrative that ancient peoples found meaningful, cannot be determined from archaeology alone. The physical evidence shows sophisticated capability appearing relatively early. The textual evidence insists that capability was taught. And beneath both layers of evidence sits the claim that refuses to fit comfortably into either category. Before humans maintained these systems, someone else built them. The flood narratives preserve the most disturbing aspect of Anunnaki characterization. They describe beings who initiated a catastrophe they could not control, suffered consequences they had not anticipated, and swore binding oaths afterward to constrain their own future behaviour. This is not how omnipotent entities behave. This is how officials behave when policy decisions produce outcomes that exceed projections. The Eridu Genesis describes the decision to send the flood as emerging from divine assembly, a consensus process among multiple authorities. The gods agreed. The gods decreed. The language emphasizes collective decision-making rather than unilateral divine action. Then, when the waters began rising, the same text describes the Anunnaki lifting torches and fleeing, setting the land ablaze with their flares as they retreated. They didn't command the storm, they ran from it. The Atrahasis Epic provides more specific detail. When the floodwaters escalate beyond intended levels, Enlil attempts to seal the water sources but fails to stop the inundation. The gods retreat to what the text calls the highest heaven, where they crouch against the outer walls like dogs. The comparison is deliberately undignified. These are not serene cosmic observers watching their plan unfold. These are panicked administrators discovering that the disaster they authorized has exceeded their capacity to manage it. Then comes hunger. The Epic of Gilgamesh preserves the most explicit account. After 7 days and nights of flooding, the text describes the gods weeping, their lips parched with thirst, parched during a flood. The detail seems almost absurd, until the text explains that with humanity destroyed, there are no temple offerings, no bread, no beer, no roasted meat. The sacrificial system has collapsed, and the gods apparently required what it provided. When the survivor Utnapishtim finally offers sacrifice, after the waters recede, the gods' response is described with uncomfortable specificity. They smelled the sweet savour and crowded like flies around the sacrifice. The imagery is visceral and undignified. These beings aren't expressing symbolic appreciation for worship. They're hungry, and they're converging on food they desperately need. The sacrifice isn't spiritual acknowledgement, it's sustenance. Enlil arrives late to find the boat and its survivors, and his reaction is rage. Who escaped? No man was to survive the destruction. But Ea confronts him with language that reads like bureaucratic criticism. How could you, unreasoning, bring on the deluge? On the sinner impose his sin, on the transgressor impose his transgression. But be lenient, lest he be cut off. Be patient, lest he be dislodged. Ea accuses Enlil of being unreasoning, of acting without proper calculation, of destroying the labour force without considering operational consequences. This is one official calling out another for administrative incompetence. And Enlil listens. He doesn't respond with divine wrath at being questioned. He adjusts his position, blesses Utnapishtim, grants him immortality as compensation for the disaster. Then the divine assembly swears an oath, recorded explicitly in multiple versions, never to repeat this action. They bind themselves legally to avoid future similar decisions. This represents a collective acknowledgement that their judgment failed and requires formal constraint. This behaviour pattern appears nowhere else in ancient flood mythology with comparable detail. The biblical account describes God flooding the earth with complete control, preserving Noah according to precise plan, covenanting with humanity afterward. From a position of absolute authority, there's sorrow perhaps, but no panic, no loss of control, no hunger, no institutional oath-taking to prevent recurrence. Greek mythology presents Zeus flooding the earth to punish human wickedness, observing from Olympus, allowing Deucalion and Pyrrha to survive according to design. The gods remain unaffected by the catastrophe they inflict. They don't cower or starve or swear institutional oaths to constrain future behaviour. They exercise power and remain untouched by its consequences. The Sumerian account inverts this pattern. The Anunnaki authorise destruction that exceeds their control, suffer physical deprivation they didn't predict, and implement procedural constraints to prevent repetition. They demonstrate vulnerability, dependence, and fallibility. The flood reveals not omnipotence, but operational limits, boundaries beyond which their authority cannot effectively function. This characterization creates profound interpretive problems. If these texts are purely mythological, why do they undermine divine authority so thoroughly? Mythology across cultures typically glorifies divine power, presenting gods as ultimately capable of managing the forces they control. But Sumerian flood narratives systematically depict divine failure, poor planning, inadequate control, unintended consequences, desperate hunger, institutional reform to prevent recurrence. If the texts are historical in some sense, if they preserve distorted memories of actual events, then what kind of beings are being described? Entities powerful enough to trigger global catastrophe, but not powerful enough to fully control it. Beings dependent on human offerings for sustenance. Administrators who make consequential mistakes and implement procedural reforms afterward. These characteristics don't map onto gods in any theological sense. They map onto something else, something the texts don't have. Vocabulary to categorize differently. The goddess Ishtar's lament appears in multiple versions of the flood narrative and reveals the emotional response to administrative failure. She cries out, "The olden days are turned to clay. I commanded evil in the assembly of the gods. How could I command such evil? For it is I who give birth to my people." This is regret born from recognizing that decisions made collectively in assembly produced outcomes that were morally unacceptable in retrospect. The language suggests institutional decision-making that lacked adequate consequence assessment. The detail about the gods crowding like flies around the first post-flood sacrifice deserves particular attention. The comparison strips away every vestige of transcendent dignity. Flies are desperate scavengers drawn to sustenance by need, not choice. The text uses this imagery deliberately to convey the depth of divine dependence on human offerings. Whatever the Anunnaki were, they apparently required what the sacrificial system provided, so much so that its interruption produced genuine crisis. This dependence relationship suggests the temple economy was not merely symbolic worship, but functional exchange. Humans provided offerings, labour and maintenance of urban infrastructure. In return, the Anunnaki provided what exactly? The texts indicate knowledge transmission, administrative guidance, access to technologies or capabilities humans lacked independently. The relationship reads more like economic interdependence than theological hierarchy. The oath sworn by the divine assembly after the flood becomes significant in this context. They formally constrain their own future behaviour, acknowledging that their previous decision-making process was inadequate. This suggests they operated within some larger framework of accountability, that they weren't autonomous ultimate authorities but administrators within systems that placed constraints on their actions. The oath binds them to procedural limits they accept as legitimate. But who or what could hold the Anunnaki accountable to such oaths? The texts never specify. They describe the assembly swearing among themselves, establishing self-imposed constraints. Whether this reflects genuine institutional limitation or merely represents narrative device to explain why floods don't recur cannot be determined from the texts alone. But the pattern suggests these beings understood themselves as operating within boundaries, not as ultimate unconstrained powers. The flood also reveals operational dependencies that undermine the image of divine self-sufficiency. If the Anunnaki required human offerings for sustenance, they required human labour to produce those offerings. They required functioning agricultural systems, maintained irrigation networks, operational temple complexes. The destruction of humanity threatened this entire infrastructure, leaving the gods starving until the survivor could re-establish the sacrificial system. This creates a paradox. Beings powerful enough to flood the earth are simultaneously vulnerable enough to starve when the human population that maintains their food supply is destroyed. The juxtaposition of capabilities seems contradictory unless the Anunnaki possessed certain powerful technologies, perhaps weather manipulation, perhaps water control systems, while remaining biologically dependent on regular sustenance that they required human systems to provide. The texts describe this dependence matter-of-factly, without apparent recognition of how it undermines theological categories. The gods need humanity, not for worship in some abstract spiritual sense, but for practical material support. This need constrains their behaviour, forces them to preserve at least some human population, and motivates them to teach humans the technologies necessary to maintain the systems the gods depend on. The instruction given to Utnapishtim before the flood reflects this practical concern. Ea warns him explicitly, provides detailed construction specifications for the boat, tells him precisely what to preserve, not just his family, but skilled workers, livestock, seeds. The selection criteria ensure that post-flood reconstruction can occur, that the agricultural and economic systems can be rebuilt quickly. This is continuity planning, preserving the functional elements necessary for system restoration. After the flood, when kingship descends from heaven again, the texts describe not merely political restoration, but infrastructural rebuilding. The cities must be re-established, irrigation systems reconstructed, temple complexes rebuilt. The process requires human labour operating under divine instruction, the same pattern that supposedly existed before the flood, now being reinstated after catastrophic interruption. The measurement of post-flood time creates its own mystery. The King List records that after the deluge, rulers began reigning for impossibly long but gradually decreasing periods. The numbers decline from 100 years to 960 to 600, approaching plausible ranges only after several dynasties. This gradient suggests not merely human lifespans changing, but something about time itself, or how time was measured shifting across the post-flood period towards stability. What the texts reveal through the flood narrative is vulnerability. The Anunnaki made catastrophic miscalculations, suffered tangible consequences, fled disasters they couldn't control, and implemented institutional reforms to prevent recurrence. They demonstrated dependence on human systems for their own sustenance. They bound themselves to procedural constraints through formal oaths. None of this describes omnipotent cosmic entities. All of it describes officials navigating consequences of failed policy within systems that constrain their authority. And beneath the flood, narrative-specific details lies the broader implication. These beings, whatever they were, operated within limits. They possessed significant powers, but not unlimited power. They influenced events, but couldn't fully control outcomes. They made decisions collectively through assembly processes, rather than exercising unilateral authority. The question remains what those limits actually were, and who or what established them. The numbers themselves refuse to cooperate with any simple explanation. When the Sumerian King List records that Alalim reigned for 28,800 years, it's not using poetic language or symbolic approximation. It's using specific mathematical units called Sar, each Sar representing exactly 3,600 years. Alalim's reign, 8 Sar. Alalgar's 36,000 years, 10 Sar. Enmenluana's 43,200 years, 12 Sar. The pattern holds through every antediluvian ruler with mathematical precision. These are the same sexagesimal units, multiples of 60, that Sumerian scribes used to calculate field areas, measure grain volumes and plan temple, construction projects. The mathematical system that produces accurate administrative calculations in thousands of economic tablets is the same system applied to measuring these impossible reigns. The scribes who could count correctly for tax purposes and irrigation planning were using identical methodology to record chronologies that violate biological possibility. If these numbers were meant to convey merely a very long time ago, Sumerian literature possessed perfectly adequate poetic language for temporal vastness. The Eridu Genesis describes days of yore and distant days when speaking generally about the past. But the King List doesn't use vague language, it uses accounting notation. And accounting doesn't exaggerate for effect, it specifies. Some scholars have suggested the Sar might represent something other than solar years, perhaps lunar cycles, seasonal periods, or generational counts. If you divide 28,800 by various conversion factors, you can produce numbers closer to plausible human lifespans. But the problem is that the text never indicates any conversion is necessary. Later sections of the King List, covering historically verified rulers from the Third Millennium BC, use standard year counts that line precisely with archaeological chronology. The scribes knew how to record normal human reign lengths. They demonstrated this capacity for 2/3 of the document. They simply didn't apply it to the earliest section. And crucially, they never explained why. No Sumerian text, not hymns, not commentaries, not temple records, offers any gloss on these figures. No scribe added a marginal note saying, these represent symbolic time, or this reflects a different calendar system. The numbers stand without justification, as though they required none. Later, Babylonian scholars who copied the King List 1,500 years after its original composition preserved these values exactly, adding no commentary, no explanation, no indication that anything seemed unusual. The post-flood numbers create a different kind of problem. After the deluge, when kingship descended from heaven to Kish, the first ruler reigned 1,200 years, his successor 960 years, the third 600 years. These aren't measured in Sar anymore. They're expressed in standard years, but they remain biologically impossible. Then the reign lengths gradually decline, 420 years, 300 years, 240 years, until around the dynasty of Uruk, they begin approaching ranges that could theoretically accommodate human biology. Gilgamesh is listed as reigning 126 years, extraordinary but not physically inconceivable, if the number represents something other than personal rule. His successor, Ur-Nungal, 30 years. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty of Ur, the numbers match archaeological evidence with precision. The document transitions from impossible to verifiable without marking any boundary, as though the chronology gradually stabilizes from one mode into another across generations. This creates a gradient rather than a break. The King List doesn't present two distinct types of time, mythological and historical, separated by clear boundary. It presents a continuum, a slow descent from numbers that cannot be true into numbers that demonstrably are true, with no indication of where one ends and the other begins. It's as though the text describes a world where time itself functioned differently before gradually conforming to the patterns we recognize. The absence of explanation becomes the central mystery. Ancient cultures typically contextualize their extraordinary claims. Biblical texts frame Methuselah's 969 years within theological narrative about human corruption and divine patience. Egyptian sources present the eternal reign of pharaohs within cosmic cycles of Ma'at, but Sumerian texts provide no framing. They record measurements using administrative notation and move on. The precision itself demands attention. These aren't round numbers or poetic approximations. Enmenluana reigns exactly 43,200 years, 12 Sar precisely calculated. Dumuzid the shepherd reigns exactly 36,000 years, 10 Sar. The mathematical relationships are consistent. Multiples of 60, the fundamental unit of Sumerian calculation. Whatever these numbers represent, they were important enough to preserve with exactitude across centuries of transmission. Later scribal traditions maintained this precision even when they no longer understood, or perhaps chose not to explain, what was being measured. The tradition of copying these figures intact was stronger than any impulse to rationalize or reinterpret them. This suggests the numbers possessed authority that transcended comprehension. They were preserved not because anyone could verify them, but because the textual tradition demanded their faithful transmission. The mathematical structure points toward intentional encoding rather than accumulated error. If these numbers resulted from scribal mistakes or oral tradition inflation, we would expect random variation, irregular patterns, differences between copies from different cities. Instead, we find mathematical consistency, precise ratios, identical values across independent manuscript traditions. The pattern suggests design rather than distortion, but design for what purpose? If the goal was merely to glorify ancient rulers by attributing impossible longevity, why use such specific calculations? Why not simply say countless years or ages beyond measure? If the purpose was to encode astronomical data or mathematical relationships, why present it as political chronology? The format creates confusion rather than clarity, suggesting either the encoding was meant to be obscure or the numbers actually represent what they appear to represent. Attempts to measure something using the only units available. The Sumerian mathematical system was sophisticated enough to handle complex calculations. Temple archives demonstrate their capability for tracking elaborate economic relationships, compound interest, geometric progressions. They could calculate field areas from irregular measurements, predict grain yields from seed quantities, project labour requirements for construction projects. Their mathematics worked for practical purposes. So when that same mathematical system produces 240,200 total years of antediluvian kingship, calculated as 67 Sar, we face a choice. Either the scribes abandoned their normally reliable methodology for this particular application, or they were attempting to measure something real using tools adequate for the task. The numbers themselves don't indicate which interpretation is correct. They simply sit there, mathematically consistent and biologically impossible, daring anyone to explain them. The transition period between impossible and plausible reign lengths corresponds roughly with the gradual emergence of historical verification. As reign lengths decline toward human ranges, they begin overlapping with archaeological evidence, diplomatic correspondence, and cross-reference sources from other regions. The point where the King List becomes historically reliable is approximately the point where the numbers become biologically possible. This correlation suggests that whatever prevented verification of earlier reigns was connected to their temporal impossibility. But this creates circular reasoning. We can't verify the early reigns because the numbers are impossible. The numbers seem impossible because we can't verify them. The lack of independent confirmation for 28,800-year reigns might mean they never occurred, or it might mean that normal archaeological methodology cannot detect events from periods measured in units we don't understand. The evidence is absence, and absence proves nothing definitively. What remains is mathematical precision applied to chronological impossibility, preserved across millennia by scribal traditions that valued accuracy in every other domain. The numbers function like a locked box, clearly intentional, carefully maintained, but opaque in purpose. They measure something. They measure it precisely. They measure it consistently across independent copies and centuries of transmission. The question isn't whether the measurements are accurate. The question is what units are being measured and whether time itself behaved the way these calculations suggest before it settled into the chronology we recognise as normal. The geographic precision cuts through any attempt to dismiss these accounts as abstract theology. The Anunnaki don't inhabit some vague celestial realm. They live at specific addresses. Enki resides in Eridu, Enlil governs from Nippur, Nana oversees Ur, Inanna rules Uruk, Ninhursag manages Adab, Utu controls Sipar, Ningirsu commands Girsu. These aren't symbolic associations, they're jurisdictions, documented with the same administrative specificity used to record human political territories. The Sumerian temple hymns, a collection of 42 compositions from around 2300 BC, functions essentially as a divine organizational directory. Each hymn addresses a specific temple in a specific city, names the deity who resides there, and catalogues their areas of administrative responsibility. Temple of Enki in Eridu manages freshwater resources, oversees ritual purification, controls wisdom and craftsmanship. Temple of Enlil in Nippur determines political authority, commands atmospheric phenomena, executes divine decrees. The structure reads like a governmental handbook, not religious poetry. The geographic detail extends to property boundaries. The debate between hoe and plough, a Sumerian wisdom text, mentions Enlil's estate in Nippur, with references to specific fields and irrigation channels. The hymn to Inanna describes her temple complex in Uruk with architectural precision, courtyards, gates, storage rooms, sleeping quarters. These are physical locations being documented, not metaphorical dwelling places in some spiritual dimension. This represents a fundamental difference from other ancient pantheons. Greek gods inhabited Mount Olympus, a real mountain, yes, but one that existed outside normal civic administration. They didn't maintain offices in Athens or Sparta. They influenced human affairs through oracles and occasional interventions, but they operated from a realm separated from everyday urban management. Norse gods dwelled in Asgard, requiring the Bifrost Bridge to access human space. The geography itself marked the distinction between divine and mortal realms. Egyptian theology did associate gods with specific cult centres. Ptah in Memphis, Ra in Heliopolis, Amun in Thebes, but Egyptian texts emphasized the gods' cosmic nature. They were forces that manifested in particular locations, but existed fundamentally beyond geography. The temple was where divine energy touched earth, not where the god actually resided in any administrative sense. The Sumerian model inverts this relationship. The Anunnaki aren't cosmic forces who occasionally manifest in cities. They're residents of cities who happen to control certain forces. The distinction is crucial. A cosmic force manifesting in Memphis is fundamentally different from an administrator maintaining an office in Memphis. The first is theological, the second is organisational. Cylinder seals reinforce this administrative reading. Hundreds of seals from the Third Millennium BC depict gods in architectural settings, temples, administrative buildings, shown conducting activities that look remarkably like management work. One seal shows Ningersu with farming tools overseeing irrigation projects. Another shows Nana with scribes presenting what appear to be accounting tablets. These aren't symbolic representations of cosmic principles. These are portraits of officials conducting inspections and receiving reports. The texts describe territorial disputes among these divine administrators that read exactly like border conflicts between human city-states. The cycle of narratives about Inanna and Enki recounts how Inanna travelled to Eridu, manipulated Enki during a banquet, and successfully stole over 100 ME, transferable cultural attributes and technologies, carrying them back to her own jurisdiction in Uruk. Enki sent servants to pursue her and retrieve the stolen property. She escaped, and the Me remained in Uruk. This is described as theft, complete with pursuit and failed recovery attempts. The boundary dispute between Lagash and Umma involved the god Ningersu directly. Texts describe how Ningersu's territory was encroached upon by Umma's expansion, and how he intervened through what reads like legal action rather than merely divine favour. Boundary stones marking the disputed territory were inscribed with his authority. This is property law involving divine landholders, documented with the same precision used for human property disputes. Temple archives from Girsu contain economic records tracking offerings delivered to specific deities, itemized by recipient with the same detail used for human officials. Monthly rations of bread, beer and livestock specified by name. Inanna receives designated amounts. Ninurta receives designated amounts. Dumuzi receives designated amounts. The tablets specify not just what was delivered, but where within the temple complex. Which room, which altar, which storage chamber. These are delivery receipts documenting material transactions. The bureaucratic language extends to divine travel. When gods move between cities in Sumerian narratives, texts describe the logistics with itinerary-level detail. The journey of Nana to Nippur catalogues every city Nana passes through on his way to visit Enlil, listing the local deities who greet him at each stop, the ceremonies performed, the offerings presented. It reads like a diplomatic journey requiring protocol coordination at every stage. This geographic embedding creates profound interpretive problems. If the Anunnaki are purely mythological constructs, personifications of natural forces or symbolic representations of human social structures, why are they documented with such relentless administrative precision? Why record their exact addresses, their property boundaries, their travel itineraries, their delivery receipts? The level of detail exceeds what mythology requires and suggests something closer to historical record-keeping, except that what's being recorded violates every category of historical possibility. The consistency across independent sources compounds the mystery. Temple hymns from different cities, economic tablets from different archives, narrative cycles from different scribal traditions, all present the same geographic framework. Enki is always in Eridu. Enlil is always in Nippur. The associations aren't fluid or variable. They're fixed, as though documenting actual jurisdictional assignments rather than merely expressing religious preferences. archaeological evidence confirms the antiquity of these associations. The earliest textual references to Enki connect him with Eridu, and excavations show Eridu was indeed among the oldest continuously occupied settlements in Mesopotamia, with building levels extending back to the 6th millennium BC. The correlation between textual claims about Eridu's primacy and archaeological evidence of its extreme age is precise. But correlation doesn't establish causation. It doesn't explain why this particular city was associated with this particular deity, or what that association originally signified. The geographic specificity also appears in descriptions of divine assemblies. Texts indicate these gatherings occurred in particular locations, most frequently in Nippur at Enlil's temple complex. The assembly is described meeting in a specific chamber called the Ubshukina, where decisions affecting both divine and human realms were debated and decreed. The architectural precision suggests either elaborate mythological world-building or documentation of actual institutional practices whose nature we no longer understand. When texts describe gods eating, they specify what and where. When they describe gods sleeping, they mention which chamber. When they describe gods travelling, they list the route. The mundane specificity accumulates until it becomes difficult to maintain that these are purely symbolic narratives. Either Sumerian scribes invested enormous effort in creating detailed fictional geography for their pantheon, or they were documenting something they understood to be real, something that occupied actual space in actual cities. The economic dimension becomes impossible to ignore. Temple complexes weren't merely religious sites. They functioned as administrative centres, economic hubs, storage facilities, and redistribution networks. The temples controlled vast agricultural lands, employed thousands of workers, managed complex trade relationships. The offerings delivered to resident deities weren't symbolic gestures. They represented real economic flows: grain, livestock, textiles, precious metals, moving through the temple system in quantities that required sophisticated accounting. Those accounting tablets treat divine recipients with the same administrative precision applied to human officials. The gods receive specified rations on regular schedules. The deliveries are recorded, audited, tracked across time. If this is purely theological symbolism, it's symbolism that required maintaining elaborate economic fictions complete with detailed bookkeeping. The simpler explanation is that something was actually being delivered to someone, and that someone was understood to reside in the temple complex where the deliveries occurred. But this creates the central impossibility. If the Anunnaki were physical beings residing in temple complexes, receiving material goods, maintaining jurisdictional territories, and conducting administrative business, where is the physical evidence of their presence? Where are the remains? Where are the artifacts that would distinguish divine residents from human priests? The archaeological record shows temples, yes. It shows administrative tablets, yes. It shows evidence of elaborate ritual and economic activity. But it shows no evidence of a separate category of non-human residents. This absence could mean the Anunnaki never physically existed, that they were always theological constructs, and the administrative precision represents elaborate religious world-building. Or it could mean that, whatever the Anunnaki actually were, they didn't leave behind physical remains distinguishable from human activity. Or it could mean we don't yet recognise their traces because we're looking for the wrong kind of evidence. The texts insist on physical presence in specific locations. The archaeology confirms those locations existed and functioned as administrative centres. But the connection between textual claims and physical evidence remains suspended, neither confirmed nor refuted, leaving the geographic precision as one more detail that refuses to resolve into either myth or history. The transfer of knowledge follows patterns that resist the standard narrative about human cultural development. In text after text, across genres and centuries, Sumerians describe themselves as receivers rather than inventors. Agriculture wasn't discovered through millennia of experimentation. It was taught by Enki. Writing didn't evolve from pictographic tallying. It was received as one of the me. Metallurgy didn't develop through gradual refinement. It was demonstrated by divine instructors who already possessed the techniques. The entire foundation of Mesopotamian civilization is framed as inheritance, not innovation. The specificity of this instruction creates problems for interpretation. The farmer's instructions, a text preserving detailed agricultural techniques, doesn't describe practices evolving through trial and error. It describes a farmer instructing his son in methods that were originally taught to humanity by Ninurta. The text preserves exact procedures, field preparation sequences, irrigation timing, seed selection criteria, harvest techniques. These are presented as transmitted knowledge, passed from divine source through human generations. The hymn to the pickaxe credits Enlil with not merely inspiring humans to invent the tool, but with demonstrating its use, showing humans how to strike the earth at proper angles, how to apply the implement to canal construction. This is technical training, not theological inspiration. The text describes physical demonstration of technique by an instructor who already mastered the skill. Temple ritual texts contain extraordinarily precise specifications for ceremonies, exact wording for prayers, precise measurements for offerings, particular gestures at designated moments in the sequence. These specifications are described as taught protocols, not traditions that emerged organically. Humans are instructed in procedures whose logic isn't explained, but whose execution must be exact. The verb forms consistently indicate transmission from those who know to those who learn. The legal codes follow the same pattern. The Code of Hammurabi presents itself as divinely revealed, with the god Shamash instructing Hammurabi in principles of justice. Whether this represents actual knowledge transfer or merely political legitimation through divine authority cannot be determined from the text alone. But what's remarkable is how complete these early legal systems appear. The principles of proportional justice, frameworks for evidence and testimony, structures for property rights and contract enforcement. These exist in sophisticated form in the earliest legal texts, not showing the gradual development typical of systems invented through social experimentation. The Code of Ur-Nammu from approximately 2100 BC already contains juridical concepts that typically require extended evolution. Graduated penalties based on social status, compensation formulas for various injuries, procedures for oath-taking, and witness testimony. These appear essentially formed as though implementing a comprehensive legal framework rather than developing one through iterative refinement. Administrative systems show similar characteristics. The bureaucratic structures governing Sumerian cities demonstrate organizational sophistication unusual for early states. Record-keeping systems for tracking economic transactions, taxation frameworks for resource extraction, hierarchical management structures for coordinating labour. These function as mature systems in our earliest evidence, not as experimental innovations being tested and refined. Temple archives from Gersu, dating to the Third Millennium BC, contain economic records demonstrating sophisticated accounting practices, double-entry tracking, periodic auditing, projected budgets compared against actual expenditures. These are advanced administrative techniques. Their appearance in fully functional form during the early dynastic period suggests either remarkably rapid indigenous development or implementation of accounting systems that were received as complete frameworks, the astronomical knowledge embedded in Sumerian texts creates perhaps the most acute chronological problem. The precision with which they track celestial mechanics suggests observational programs spanning centuries. Venus cycle calculations accurate to modern standards. Lunar phase predictions enabling eclipse forecasting. Understanding of planetary movements requiring generational continuity in observation and data recording. The length of year calculations preserved in administrative calendars are correct to a degree that European astronomy wouldn't match until much later periods. This precision demands long-term systematic observation, centuries of continuous data collection maintained across multiple generations. Yet this knowledge appears in texts from the early dynastic period without surviving records of the extended observational program that would have been necessary to generate it through indigenous development. Sumerian texts attribute this astronomical knowledge to divine instruction, describing how the Anunnaki taught humans to track celestial movements and recognize patterns in the sky, whether this represents actual knowledge transmission or serves as cultural explanation for capabilities whose true origins were forgotten or obscured cannot be determined from the texts themselves, but the claim appears consistently enough across independent sources to suggest it represents more than incidental mythological embellishment. Metallurgical texts preserve sophisticated understanding of alloy composition, temperature control, and material properties that typically requires extensive experimentation to develop. Bronze working techniques documented in Third Millennium sources demonstrate knowledge of optimal copper-tin ratios for different applications, ratios that produce maximum strength-to-weight performance. This suggests either lengthy indigenous experimentation whose records haven't survived, or transmission of metallurgical knowledge from sources that had already refined these techniques. Medical texts attribute diagnostic procedures and treatment protocols to divine teaching rather than accumulated human experience. The texts preserve surprisingly sophisticated anatomical knowledge, surgical procedures, and pharmaceutical preparations. Whether this medical knowledge developed through practice and observation or was taught by instructors who already possessed it is framed clearly in the texts. It was taught. The question is whether that framing reflects actual transmission or merely cultural narrative about knowledge, whose real development was more prosaic. The pattern repeats across knowledge domains with sufficient consistency to suggest it represents foundational cultural understanding rather than scattered mythological details. Sumerians understood their civilization as built on inherited knowledge. They described themselves as students of prior instructors who possessed capabilities first. Whether those instructors were pre-Sumerian human cultures, survivors from some earlier catastrophe carrying preserved knowledge, or actually the non-human Anunnaki the texts describe, this remains unresolved. What's certain is that Sumerian culture didn't describe itself as starting from scratch. The earliest texts don't present humans figuring out agriculture, inventing writing, discovering metallurgy through autonomous innovation. They present humans receiving these capabilities through instruction, implementing systems they were taught, maintaining knowledge transmitted from prior sources. The self-understanding is consistent. We inherited this, we didn't invent it. This creates tension with archaeological models emphasizing gradual indigenous development. Those models work well for many aspects of early civilization. Pottery technology shows clear developmental sequences. Architectural techniques demonstrate progressive refinement. Tool forms evolve through recognizable stages. But certain knowledge domains appear with less obvious developmental prehistory. Writing appears remarkably complete in its earliest attestations. Mathematical systems are sophisticated from their first documented uses. astronomical knowledge exists at precision levels requiring observational foundations that aren't documented in the archaeological record. The conventional explanation posits that developmental stages occurred, but evidence hasn't survived, that writing evolved from simpler precursors whose traces were lost, that mathematical systems developed gradually through unrecorded stages, that astronomical observations accumulated across generations who left no tablets documenting their work. This is plausible and may be correct. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but the textual evidence presents a different narrative, and that narrative is consistent, persistent, and specific in ways that make it difficult to dismiss as merely convenient mythological framing. The Sumerians said they were taught. They said knowledge descended from prior sources. They said humans received rather than invented the foundations of civilization. They documented this understanding across genres, across centuries, across independent scribal traditions. The question becomes which evidence to prioritize: the archaeological record that suggests gradual development, or the textual record that insists on transmission, the physical artifacts that show evolutionary sequences, or the written accounts that describe instruction. Neither set of evidence is complete. Both admit multiple interpretations, and the space between them remains occupied by claims about knowledge transfer that we can neither confirm nor definitively refute. Somewhere in that unresolved space sits the possibility that what the Sumerians recorded about their own origins contains some element of accurate memory about how their civilization actually began. The claim about human creation purpose appears with uncomfortable consistency. Humans weren't created as the pinnacle of divine craftsmanship or fashioned to appreciate the cosmos, or brought into being to fulfill some grand cosmic destiny. According to Sumerian and Akkadian texts, humans were engineered to solve a labour problem. The Anunnaki needed workers. The solution was to create a being capable of maintaining the agricultural and urban infrastructure that divine administrators were exhausted from managing themselves. The Atrahasis Epic frames this most explicitly. The text describes a period when the Igigi, lesser divine beings, were assigned to dig irrigation canals and maintain cities. They laboured for what the text suggests were extended periods, growing increasingly resentful of the physical burden. Eventually they revolted, burning their tools and surrounding Enlil's temple to demand relief. The text describes this as a labour strike, complete with collective action and demands for change working conditions. The divine assembly convened to address the crisis. The problem wasn't theological or morale, it was operational. The work still needed to be done, but the current workforce refused to continue. Enki proposed a solution: create a replacement labour force specifically designed for the task. The goddess Belet Ili would mix clay with the blood of a slain god, Wi'ilu, described as a god who possessed intelligence, to fashion a new being. The text uses the term Lulu, which translates approximately as primitive worker or mixed creature. The creation process is described with procedural detail that reads more like manufacturing specifications than theological narrative. 7 male and 7 female forms are created simultaneously. The clay is mixed with divine blood to transmit some essential quality, perhaps biological characteristics, perhaps something the text doesn't have vocabulary to describe more precisely. The beings are fashioned, animated, and immediately assigned to labour. Their purpose is explicit: to bear the yoke that the gods have been carrying, to take over the work of maintaining civilization's infrastructure. This creation narrative contains no suggestion that humans represent a cherished project, or that they were made to glorify their creators. They were made to work. The motivation is pragmatic rather than theological. The texts frame human creation as problem-solving through biological engineering, designing a being whose capabilities match the functional requirements of the labour that needs performing. The term Lulu appears in multiple contexts across Mesopotamian literature, consistently carrying connotations of mixture, primitiveness, or service function. Some texts pair it with Awalum, a term for fully civilized humans, suggesting a distinction between created workers and whatever human populations existed independently or emerged later. The linguistic evidence hints at complexity in how Mesopotamian cultures understood human origins and human categories. Later Akkadian versions of creation narratives preserve similar themes. In Enuma Elish, after the cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat establishes Babylonian cosmic order, Marduk proposes creating humans explicitly to serve the gods, so that the gods may be at leisure. The purpose is stated clearly: to relieve divine beings of labour burden. Humans are created from the blood of Chingu, the defeated enemy leader, mixing divine essence with the substance of rebellion to produce beings capable of work. The blood component appears consistently across multiple creation accounts and deserves attention. Divine blood isn't described as metaphorical or symbolic. It's presented as necessary biological material, something that transmits essential characteristics to the created beings. Whether this represents some understanding of genetic inheritance, some intuition about biological transmission of traits, or merely theological symbolism, cannot be determined from the texts, but the consistency with which divine blood is described as necessary ingredient suggests it served functional purpose in the creation process as the texts understood it. This functional creation narrative contrasts sharply with how other ancient cultures describe human origins. The biblical account in Genesis presents humans created in God's image, given dominion over earth, blessed and commissioned to be fruitful and multiply. The emphasis is on status, authority, and relationship with the divine creator. Egyptian creation narratives describe humans emerging from the tears of Ra, or being shaped on the potter's wheel of Khnum, brought into being through acts that are fundamentally generative rather than utilitarian. Greek mythology presents Prometheus shaping humans from clay and Athena breathing life into them, with subsequent narrative focusing on Prometheus's gift of fire and knowledge despite divine prohibition. The emphasis is on human potential, cunning, and the dangerous gift of capabilities that elevate humans beyond their originally intended status. The creation serves narrative purposes, exploring human nature and divine human relationships. But Sumerian texts strip away these theological layers. Humans were made to dig canals. They were fashioned to maintain irrigation systems, harvest fields, construct buildings, provide offerings to temples. The relationship between humans and Anunnaki is framed as fundamentally economic, an exchange of labour for protection and knowledge, not a spiritual connection between creator and created. This pragmatic framing extends to how texts describe ongoing human-divine relationships. Temple offerings aren't primarily spiritual worship. They're understood as provision of sustenance that divine beings require. The flood narrative's detail about gods starving when offerings cease makes this explicit. The sacrificial system isn't symbolic, it's functional. Humans provide material goods, and divine beings apparently need what humans provide. The economic interdependence creates a relationship structure that resembles feudalism or client-patron dynamics more than theological hierarchy. Humans serve Anunnaki interests through labour and offerings. In return, Anunnaki provide knowledge, governance structures, and protection from threats humans cannot manage independently. The relationship is transactional rather than devotional. This framework suggests that whatever the Anunnaki actually were, if they were anything beyond mythological constructs, they required human labour for reasons that were practical rather than abstract. They needed work performed. They needed regular provisions. They established systems ensuring humans would provide both. The creation narrative in this reading documents the establishment of that labour relationship through biological engineering, designed to produce beings suited for the required tasks. The question of why beings powerful enough to flood Earth would need human labour creates its own paradox. If the Anunnaki possessed capabilities that allowed them to manipulate natural forces on catastrophic scales, why couldn't they simply automate or eliminate the need for agricultural and urban maintenance? The texts provide no direct answer, but they consistently describe the Anunnaki as requiring regular sustenance, needing physical labour performed, depending on systems that humans maintained. One possibility is that the Anunnaki possessed certain powerful technologies, perhaps climate manipulation, perhaps large-scale engineering capabilities, while remaining biologically similar enough to humans to require food, shelter, and regular material support. They could trigger floods, but they couldn't eliminate their need to eat. They could design cities, but they still required someone to maintain them. The combination of extraordinary powers with mundane vulnerabilities would explain both their capability to create humans and their need to do so. Another possibility is that the labour requirements weren't about physical work, but about something the texts describe as service, that we don't have frameworks to properly understand. Perhaps the offerings and rituals serve purposes beyond mere food provision. Perhaps they maintained technologies, powered systems, or fulfilled functions that the texts lack vocabulary to describe more precisely than offerings please the gods. Or perhaps the entire narrative is mythological, and the creation accounts reflect how early Mesopotamian cultures made sense of their social structures by projecting them onto cosmic origins. Humans serve temple complexes and political hierarchies. Therefore, humans were made to serve. The narrative justifies existing social relationships by presenting them as divinely ordained from creation. This reading treats the texts as ideology rather than documentation. But even if the creation narratives serve ideological purposes, they reveal how Sumerians understood their own position. They didn't see themselves as the crown of creation or the primary purpose of cosmic order. They saw themselves as workers, beings created to serve functions within systems they didn't design. That self-understanding persisted across centuries of cultural transmission, suggesting it represented something fundamental about how Mesopotamian civilizations conceived of human purpose and human origins. The texts insist humans were made, not born from natural emergence. They insist human creation had specific purpose tied to labour requirements. They insist the creators were beings who possessed power, but also faced constraints that made human creation necessary rather than optional. Whether any of this describes actual events or merely reflects cultural narratives, it represents a remarkably consistent understanding of human origins as functional rather than sacred, utilitarian rather than devotional, economic rather than theological. And beneath that understanding sits an implication the texts never quite state directly. If humans were created to serve Anunnaki purposes, then human autonomy, the assumption that humans determine their own destiny, may be more limited than we prefer to believe. The genetic modification claim sits at the boundary between mythology and something we now possess technical vocabulary to discuss seriously. When Sumerian texts describe Belet Ili mixing clay with divine blood to create humans, they may be encoding biological engineering concepts in the only language available to Bronze Age scribes. The detail about divine blood being necessary for human creation reads differently in an era when we understand that biological characteristics are transmitted through genetic material carried in blood cells. The Epic of Atrahasis specifies that the blood came from Wi'ilu, a god who possessed Ti'ima, a term usually translated as intelligence or personality, but which might represent something more specific. The text indicates this particular divine being was selected for a reason. His blood contained qualities necessary for the created humans to possess. This suggests intentional selection of genetic material based on desired characteristics, a concept that maps onto modern genetic engineering with uncomfortable precision. The creation process involves mixing this blood with clay, which the texts describe as the basic material substance. Whether clay represents literal earth, or serves as metaphor for base biological matter, perhaps cellular material, perhaps basic organic compounds, cannot be determined. But the consistent emphasis on mixture suggests the texts are describing combination of two distinct materials, one providing basic physical substance, the other transmitting specific inheritable characteristics. The Enuma Elish preserves a parallel account where Marduk creates humans from the blood of Chingu, the defeated rebel leader. Again, blood is the essential ingredient for transmitting necessary qualities. The choice of Chingu, described as possessing intelligence and leadership capabilities, suggests selection based on specific traits that would transfer to created beings. The text frames this as intentional biological design, choosing source material that will produce beings with desired characteristics. Multiple creation narratives specify that the process produced beings who were similar to gods but limited in certain capacities. Humans possessed intelligence, apparently inherited from divine blood, but lacked the extended lifespans attributed to Anunnaki. They could learn skills but required instruction rather than possessing innate knowledge. They were strong enough for labour but not powerful enough to threaten divine authority. The limitations appear designed rather than accidental. This pattern of intentional limitation appears explicitly in later texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes the hero as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a specific ratio suggesting measured mixing of biological materials. Gilgamesh possesses extraordinary strength and extended lifespan compared to normal humans, but remains mortal and ultimately subject to death. He represents an intermediate category, neither fully divine nor fully human, suggesting that the degree of divine blood mixing determined resulting characteristics. The Sumerian King Lists, recording of gradually declining post-flood lifespans, might reflect this genetic dilution. If early post-flood rulers possessed higher ratios of divine blood, they would display capabilities closer to Anunnaki characteristics, including extended lifespans. As generations passed and genetic mixing continued, the divine contribution would dilute, causing capabilities to decline toward baseline human ranges. The mathematical progression in the King List, about 200 years, 960 years, 600 years, gradually approaching normal ranges, could represent generational genetic dilution across time. This interpretation would explain why the text preserves such precise numerical sequences. If the numbers track biological capabilities declining through genetic dilution, then recording them accurately matters for understanding hereditary patterns. The numbers wouldn't be symbolic or exaggerated. They would be attempting to document observable changes in human capabilities across generations following some initial modification event. Modern genetics has identified anomalous DNA sequences in human populations that lack clear evolutionary pathways. Some of these sequences appear suddenly in the genetic record without obvious precursors. While mainstream genetics explains these through mutation, horizontal gene transfer, or incomplete fossil records, the patterns do create questions about whether all human genetic material emerged through purely natural selection processes. The questions remain scientifically legitimate, even if answers pointing toward genetic modification are speculative. The distribution of certain genetic markers shows geographic patterns that loosely correlate with regions where texts describe Anunnaki concentrations. Populations descended from ancient Near Eastern groups show particular genetic signatures that appear at higher frequencies than in other regions. Whether this reflects ancient genetic modification, normal population genetics, or merely coincidental distribution cannot be determined from genetic data alone, but the correlation exists and deserves acknowledgement. The texts describe royal bloodlines as requiring careful maintenance to preserve specific hereditary characteristics. Egyptian pharaohs practiced sibling marriage despite obvious genetic costs, high rates of congenital disorders that plagued royal families. Yet the practice continued for millennia, suggesting that maintaining certain genetic markers took priority over health concerns. Similar patterns appear in Mesopotamian royal families, where marriage within restricted lineages preserved what texts describe as divine heritage. If genetic modification had occurred in the distant past, producing lineages with enhanced capabilities or biological characteristics enabling interaction with certain technologies, then maintaining those bloodlines would require exactly this kind of careful marriage restriction. The practice would make sense as preserving functional genetic traits rather than merely expressing cultural preferences or political strategy. The genetic costs would be acceptable if the maintained traits provided sufficient advantage. Sumerian texts specify that certain priestly positions could only be held by individuals from particular families. These weren't honorary hereditary titles but functional requirements. The tablets indicate specific families maintained knowledge and capabilities necessary for operating temple systems, and that these capabilities were inherited biologically as much as learned through training. The requirement suggests certain individuals possessed physiological characteristics, enabling them to perform functions others could not. The Tablets of Destiny, described in multiple texts as devices granting control over natural forces, apparently required biometric authentication. They would function only for operators whose biological markers matched authorization protocols. The Epic of Anzu describes how the bird demon Anzu stole the tablets, but couldn't properly control them, producing chaos because the devices recognized unauthorized access. This suggests the tablets verified operator identity through biological characteristics before granting functional access. Whether such devices actually existed, or whether the texts describe elaborate mythological objects, cannot be determined from textual evidence alone. But if the descriptions preserve distorted memories of actual technologies, those technologies would have required genetic compatibility to operate, exactly what the texts describe. The authorization system would explain why only certain bloodlines could access certain functions, and why maintaining those bloodlines through restricted marriage mattered operationally rather than merely symbolically. The question of whether ancient genetic modification actually occurred cannot be answered definitively from available evidence. The texts consistently describe it. They provide procedural details suggesting biological engineering. They track hereditary patterns that might represent genetic dilution. They document bloodline maintenance practices that would make functional sense if genetic traits needed preservation. But text describing events doesn't prove events occurred. What can be said with certainty is that Mesopotamian cultures understood themselves as biologically connected to divine beings through hereditary transmission. They believed that mixing of divine and human biological materials produced offspring with intermediate characteristics. They maintained that certain capabilities were inherited genetically through bloodlines rather than merely learned culturally through training. This understanding persisted across centuries and shaped actual social practices, including marriage restrictions and hereditary office assignments. Whether this understanding reflects actual biological engineering from an earlier era represents cultural interpretation of normal human genetic variation, or merely expresses how ancient peoples made sense of hereditary differences in capabilities and status, this remains unresolved. The genetic modification claim cannot be confirmed from current evidence, but neither can it be definitively dismissed without explaining why Bronze Age texts would describe biological engineering concepts with such procedural specificity, and why those descriptions would persist across independent cultural traditions. The texts preserve something, whether that something is memory of actual events, metaphorical encoding of social relationships, or theological narrative about human origins, remains the question that sits at the intersection of archaeology, genetics, and textual interpretation, refusing to resolve cleanly into any single framework. The surveillance claim appears embedded in terminology that spans multiple ancient languages. The Akkadian term Igi appears frequently in texts referring to the Anunnaki's oversight functions. It translates literally as eye or watcher, but in administrative contexts it carries connotations of inspection, verification, and supervisory authority. Temple officials called Igi were auditors who verified accounts and monitored compliance with regulations. When the same term is applied to divine beings, it suggests they performed similar monitoring functions on larger scales. The Hebrew term Ika, plural Irin, appears in the Book of Daniel and other late biblical texts, referring to beings called watchers. These are described as issuing decrees affecting earthly kingdoms, suggesting continued administrative authority. Linguistic analysis traces Iyar through Aramaic back to Akkadian Igi, indicating conceptual continuity across languages and cultures. The monitoring function persisted in how these beings were understood and named. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve additional material about watchers that standard biblical canon excluded. The Book of Enoch, existing in fragmentary form among the scrolls, describes these beings with specificity that reads more like organizational documentation than theological narrative. It catalogues their names, their specific areas of forbidden teaching, their eventual punishment. Azazel taught metallurgy and weapons manufacturing. Shemyaza taught enchantments and root cutting, activities that may represent genetic manipulation and pharmaceutical knowledge. Barakel taught astronomy. Each watcher had a specialized domain of knowledge that was transmitted to humans despite prohibitions. The Enochic tradition describes these teachings as forbidden, not because they were morally corrupting, but because they were operationally dangerous. The knowledge enabled capabilities that humans lacked wisdom to manage responsibly. Metallurgy enabled advanced weapons. Genetic knowledge enabled biological manipulation. Astronomy enabled prediction and timing for purposes the texts don't fully specify. The restriction aimed at preventing capability mismatch, humans possessing powers they couldn't control, rather than at maintaining ignorance for its own sake. The text describes how these watchers descended to Earth, using spatial vocabulary similar to how the Sumerian King List describes kingship descending from heaven. They're described taking human wives and producing offspring called Nephilim, beings of extraordinary size and strength who, consumed all the acquisitions of men, and eventually began consuming humans themselves. The language suggests these offspring exceeded sustainable parameters, creating resource competition and social disruption that triggered corrective intervention. The flood in Enochic tradition is explicitly framed as response to this violation. The Watchers transgressed boundaries by transmitting forbidden knowledge and by producing unauthorized hybrid offspring. The flood served to eliminate the Nephilim, remove the corrupted human populations who possessed dangerous knowledge, and reset civilization to baseline conditions. The Watchers themselves were imprisoned in underground locations to await final judgment. The geographic specificity in these accounts is notable. The Book of Enoch describes the Watchers' descent occurring on Mount Hermon, a real mountain on the modern Syria-Lebanon border. It describes their imprisonment in valleys and chambers with geographic detail suggesting actual locations rather than mythological underworld. Some sites are specified as being to the west, others beneath mountains, others in northern regions near the Caucasus. These are coordinates, not poetic descriptions of cosmic geography. Archaeological surveys of some regions mentioned in Enochic texts have revealed anomalies. Ground-penetrating radar has detected large void spaces beneath areas where no documented excavation occurred. Seismic studies show cavities at depths exceeding known ancient mining operations. Natural cave formation doesn't adequately explain all detected voids, and erosion patterns in some areas don't match water flow that would produce caves in those rock types. The geological explanations remain uncertain. Access to many of these sites is restricted. Some lie in military zones, others in politically sensitive territories where archaeological investigation faces obstacles. A few have been unofficially explored, producing accounts describing sealed passages, chambers with metallic surfaces showing no corrosion, and artificial lighting with no apparent power source. These accounts exist at archaeology's margins, difficult to verify and easily dismissed as misidentifications or fabrications. But they persist across different time periods from independent sources, describing similar features in locations corresponding to ancient texts. The monitoring function described in these traditions isn't presented as continuous direct observation, but as periodic evaluation and intervention when critical thresholds are crossed. The Watchers didn't micromanage human activity. They established boundaries, monitored for violations, and responded when transgressions exceeded acceptable parameters. The flood represented maximum response, complete reset when corruption became irreversible. Post-flood texts suggest the monitoring continued, but the intervention methods changed. Rather than direct physical presence and instruction, later periods show more mediated communication through dreams, visions, selected prophets. The impression is of gradual withdrawal from direct involvement while maintaining oversight capacity. Divine encounters become less frequent and less physical across the historical period that textual records document. This withdrawal pattern could indicate that monitoring systems were designed to function with decreasing intervention as human civilizations matured. Like scaffolding removed as construction progresses, direct oversight would diminish as human institutional capacity developed. Or it could indicate that whatever entities the texts describe as Anunnaki or Watchers actually departed, leaving behind only automated systems or periodic check-ins rather than continuous presence. The Sumerian texts describe underground chambers and mountain sanctuaries that remained operational even after direct Anunnaki presence decreased. These installations supposedly continued enforcing restricted access through mechanisms that didn't require conscious oversight. Whether such installations actually exist and whether any continue functioning cannot be determined without access to the sites. texts identify access that faces significant practical obstacles, the surveillance claim connects to the earlier question about human creation purpose. If humans were created to serve specific functions within managed systems, then monitoring their development and ensuring they remain within designed parameters would be necessary operational maintenance. The oversight wouldn't reflect paranoid divine jealousy, but basic system administration, verifying that created beings function according to specification, and intervening when they deviate toward configurations that threaten system stability. The forbidden knowledge categories preserved in Enochic tradition map onto capabilities that define human technological civilization, advanced metallurgy, genetic manipulation, astronomical prediction, understanding of natural forces. These are precisely the knowledge domains that modern civilization has redeveloped. If monitoring systems were designed to track human technological development and respond when it approaches critical thresholds, then our current era, with capabilities in all forbidden categories simultaneously, would represent exactly the kind of situation designed to trigger evaluation. Whether any such monitoring systems actually exist cannot be determined from textual evidence alone. The texts describe them. They provide procedural details suggesting operational surveillance, rather than merely theological concepts. They specify locations, methods, and response protocols, but ancient descriptions don't prove modern reality. The surveillance claim remains suspended between documentation that cannot be verified and dismissal that cannot be absolute. What the texts reveal is that multiple ancient cultures understood themselves as observed by non-human entities who maintained authority to intervene in human affairs when certain boundaries were crossed. This understanding shaped legal systems, religious practices, and cultural narratives across millennia. Whether it reflected actual surveillance, cultural paranoia, or theological frameworks for understanding divine human relationships, remains the question that the texts preserve but cannot definitively answer. And beneath that question sits another. If surveillance systems were established in antiquity, would we recognise their operation today, or would they function through means we lack frameworks to perceive? The return claim appears encoded in astronomical timing mechanisms preserved across multiple cultures. Mesopotamian texts describe certain divine activities as keyed to celestial configurations, suggesting that if automated systems or scheduled interventions were established, they might activate when specific astronomical conditions recur. The precessional cycle, planetary conjunctions, eclipse sequences, these provide reliable timing mechanisms that require no external coordination once programmed. An event scheduled to occur when particular stellar alignments return would happen automatically when those conditions repeated, regardless of whether anyone remained present to initiate it. The Mayan long count calendar demonstrates this kind of astronomical timing was understood and implemented by ancient civilizations. The calendar tracks not merely human historical periods, but cosmic cycles repeating on timescales exceeding any individual culture's existence. The precision suggests the calendar preserves knowledge from sources that observed across complete precessional cycles, sources that possess data spanning 26,000 years of continuous astronomical observation, a duration no known human civilization has maintained. The knowledge must have been inherited from sources with extraordinary observational continuity, or technological means for accelerating data collection. The Sumerian astronomical texts show similar characteristics, precision requiring centuries of observation, but appearing essentially complete in early records without documented developmental stages. If this knowledge was taught rather than independently developed, then the sources doing the teaching possessed capabilities for long-term data gathering that require explanation. The current astronomical era presents several configurations that ancient texts mark as significant. The precession of equinoxes is transitioning between ages from Pisces to Aquarius, a boundary period various traditions associate with disruption and transformation. Multiple rare planetary alignments occur during coming decades. Eclipse patterns repeat on century-scale cycles approaching completion points. If ancient systems were programmed to activate during these configurations, the next several decades represent a predicted window. The Anunnaki texts describe watchers as bound until the appointed time, language suggesting temporal locks keyed to specific future conditions. Whether appointed time refers to theological concepts of final judgment or to actual chronological markers tied to astronomical cycles cannot be determined from the texts, but the specificity with which some texts describe astronomical conditions for significant events suggests technical timing mechanisms rather than merely symbolic associations. The Book of Enoch describes periods measured in generations, ages, and cosmic cycles rather than human timescales. The imprisoned watchers are bound for durations that dwarf historical memory. If these bindings or withdrawals were actually keyed to astronomical cycles, their expiration would occur on schedules bearing no relationship to human calendars. What feels like permanent absence to civilizations observing for mere millennia might represent brief interim periods in cycles operating at precessional timescales. The return claim intersects with technology threshold questions. If monitoring systems track human development and respond when capabilities approach critical levels, then our achievement of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and space exploration might trigger evaluation or intervention. Ancient texts identify these domains: genetic manipulation, creation of non-human intelligence, expansion beyond designated territories, as precisely the transgressions that prompted previous interventions. The Enochic tradition specifically catalogues genetic manipulation among forbidden teachings. Shemiaza's instruction in enchantments and root cutting may encode genetic and pharmaceutical knowledge. Modern genetic engineering capabilities now enable modification of human DNA with precision approaching what texts attribute to Anunnaki. CRISPR and related technologies allow editing genetic code with accuracy that would have seemed impossible decades ago. We possess technical means to alter human heredity in ways that persist across generations. Artificial intelligence development represents another threshold domain. The creation of non-human intelligences parallels what texts describe as the Anunnaki's creation of humans, raising questions about whether we possess adequate wisdom to responsibly manage beings we create. The texts emphasize that the Anunnaki carefully controlled human capabilities, imposing limitations designed to prevent humans from exceeding designated parameters. Our AI development proceeds without comparable constraint mechanisms. Space exploration could represent either successful graduation from managed status or premature breakout triggering corrective intervention. The texts describe Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came, suggesting they arrived from elsewhere. Human expansion into space might violate territorial restrictions the texts describe the Anunnaki maintaining. If monitoring systems were designed for Earth-based populations, off-world colonies could escape jurisdictional boundaries. Whether approaching these technological thresholds triggers any actual response depends entirely on whether the monitoring systems described in ancient texts exist and remain operational. The alternative possibility is that the texts reflect cultural concerns about human hubris, technological overreach, and the need for wisdom to accompany capability. concerns that remain philosophically valid regardless of whether divine surveillance actually occurs. The return claim cannot be verified in advance. Either something occurs during coming decades that confirms ancient texts described actual systems, or nothing occurs and the texts remain interesting mythological artifacts. The pattern of evidence doesn't allow prediction with confidence. The astronomical timing mechanisms are real. The alignments will occur as calculated. Whether anything responds to those alignments cannot be determined from available information. What can be said is that multiple ancient traditions describe beings who withdrew but did not permanently depart, who established systems designed to function across vast durations, who keyed significant events to astronomical conditions that recur on predictable schedules. The traditions describe these beings as possessing interest in human development and authority to intervene when humans exceed boundaries. Whether any of this describes reality or merely reflects how ancient peoples understood their relationship to cosmos and divine authority remains unresolved. The texts preserve claims about return without providing evidence sufficient to confirm those claims. They describe timing mechanisms without proving those mechanisms actually control anything. They document a consistent understanding across cultures that absence is not necessarily permanent and that return depends on conditions rather than arbitrary divine whim. This understanding shaped religious expectations, prophetic traditions, and cultural narratives about end times or transformative ages across civilizations. The question modern civilization faces is whether to take these ancient frameworks seriously, to consider that our technological trajectory might be monitored by systems whose existence we cannot confirm, or to proceed according to our own judgment, accepting that if monitoring exists and we cross thresholds, triggering responses, we will discover that fact through experiencing consequences rather than through heeding warnings we cannot verify. The text suggests this choice itself may represent part of the evaluation, that mature civilizations demonstrate wisdom through appropriate caution when facing capabilities whose consequences exceed their ability to predict or control. That proceeding recklessly when warned indicates developmental immaturity regardless of technical sophistication, but exercising caution based on ancient texts requires believing those texts document actual systems rather than merely mythological concerns. The return claim remains exactly where it has always been, preserved in texts that describe but cannot prove, predicted by astronomical calculations that will occur regardless of what they might trigger, suspended between documentation we cannot verify and dismissal we cannot make absolute. The ancient accounts insist something is scheduled. The timing mechanisms they reference are real. Whether anything actually responds when those mechanisms indicate appointed times approach is the question that can only be answered by waiting to see what the coming decades reveal. And somewhere in that waiting space, between what texts preserve and what evidence confirms, sits the possibility that absence has always been temporary, and that return depends not on arbitrary divine scheduling, but on observable conditions that our current development is approaching. The institutional memory problem explains why these claims remain unconfirmable. If the events described in Sumerian texts occurred during periods predating continuous historical records, and if those events were followed by catastrophic disruptions that destroyed observational continuity, then evidence would exist in fragmentary form, preserved in texts that survived, but lacking the institutional context necessary for full verification. We would have the accounts without the infrastructure that generated them, the claims without the records that would confirm them. The Sumerian cuneiform tradition lasted approximately 3 millennia before disappearing in the early centuries AD, During those 3,000 years, tablets were copied, recopied, translated between languages, transmitted across cultural boundaries. The knowledge they contained remained embedded in texts whose religious and cultural significance ensured preservation even when technical understanding faded. When cuneiform writing finally ceased, the tablets became unreadable for over 15 centuries until 19th century decipherment recovered access. This 15th century gap represents exactly the kind of knowledge discontinuity the texts themselves describe as recurring through history. Civilizational collapse disrupts information transmission, leaving subsequent cultures to rediscover what previous populations possessed. The pattern the texts identify as characteristic of post-catastrophe periods matches what actually occurred between the last cuneiform tablets and modern archaeological recovery. The fact that we can now read these texts means we've regained access to knowledge that was temporarily lost. We're post-discontinuity civilization that recovered records from pre-discontinuity sources. What we find in those recovered texts is sophisticated astronomical knowledge, advanced mathematical calculations, detailed chronologies spanning immense periods, and consistent claims about non-human entities establishing civilization's foundations. The sophistication argues against dismissing them as primitive mythology. The consistency across independent sources suggests shared information rather than coincidental invention. But the gap between when texts were written and when we regained ability to read them creates uncertainty about how much was lost in transmission. The tablets we've recovered may represent fragments of larger knowledge systems. The texts may reference other documents that haven't survived. Technical terminology may have been corrupted through copying errors accumulating across centuries. We work with incomplete and possibly degraded versions of information that was originally more comprehensive. This uncertainty is built into the situation. We cannot recover what was lost during discontinuity periods. We cannot know what additional texts existed in libraries that were destroyed or remain buried in unexcavated sites. We cannot be certain that meanings we extract from ancient technical terminology accurately reflect what original authors intended. The evidence is whatever survived, and survival is imperfect. Yet what survived is remarkable. The astronomical precision encoded in monuments and texts indicates knowledge requiring centuries of observation. The mathematical sophistication demonstrated in architectural proportions and calendrical calculations shows capabilities supposedly unavailable in those periods. The consistency of flood narratives across independent cultures suggests shared memory of actual events rather than merely parallel mythological development. The cumulative pattern of surviving evidence supports the text's claims that knowledge was inherited from earlier sources rather than invented independently by each civilization. Whether those sources were pre-flood human civilizations or non-human entities, the texts call Anunnaki remains unresolved. But that knowledge transmission occurred from sources predating historical civilizations that recorded it seems increasingly difficult to deny. This transmission framework requires accepting that sophisticated understanding existed during periods when conventional chronology places only primitive populations. It requires acknowledging gaps in archaeological record where advanced civilizations might have existed but left limited traces, perhaps because cities concentrated in coastal regions now underwater, perhaps because catastrophic events destroyed physical evidence, perhaps because preservation conditions prevented survival of materials documenting their existence. Underwater archaeological sites discovered off India, Japan, and the Mediterranean demonstrate that urban development did occur in areas now submerged. The Younger Dryas impact evidence confirms that catastrophic events destroyed civilizations during periods when flood traditions place their narratives. Preservation bias in archaeology towards stone structures means civilizations building primarily with organic materials would leave minimal traces even if sophisticated. Each factor individually provides plausible explanation for why advanced pre-flood civilizations might not appear prominently in conventional archaeological record. The ancient texts provide frameworks for understanding what that missing record might contain. They describe urban civilizations possessing advanced knowledge during periods thousands of years before conventional chronology places such development. They attribute this knowledge to teaching from non-human sources and document its partial preservation through catastrophic events that disrupted but didn't entirely eliminate information. Whether these frameworks accurately represent historical reality or are mythological constructs, ancient peoples used to explain knowledge whose actual origins they didn't understand remains the question evidence hasn't definitively answered. But the question is increasingly recognized as legitimate rather than merely speculative. The evidence is sufficient to justify serious investigation, even if it doesn't yet compel specific conclusions. Each underwater site surveyed, each ancient text translated, each genetic sequence analysed adds data that either supports or challenges various interpretive frameworks. The accumulation is gradual. The pattern that emerges remains ambiguous, but direction trends toward more information rather than less. The ancient texts themselves seem designed to enable this gradual revelation. They preserve information in forms remaining accessible across multiple interpretive stages, functioning as religious literature for populations not yet ready for technical interpretation, then as historical documents for populations developing capability to recognize embedded knowledge, then potentially as operational manuals for populations developing capability to use preserved information. If this graduated revelation is intentional design, it represents sophisticated information, encoding ensuring knowledge survives across civilizational collapses, while becoming progressively more useful as recovering civilizations redevelop capability. Whether texts actually represent such sophisticated design or accidentally possess characteristics enabling multiple interpretations depends on assumptions about original authors' intentions. If authors merely recorded mythology, technical interpretations we find may represent our projections rather than their intentions. If authors deliberately encoded knowledge for future recovery, technical interpretations may align with actual purposes. The text cannot definitively resolve this question, but certain features suggest intentionality, astronomical data precision embedded in monument proportions, numerical relationship consistency across independent traditions, multi-layered structure allowing text to function simultaneously as religious narrative and technical documentation. These characteristics would be difficult to produce accidentally. The alternative, that ancient peoples accidentally created texts functioning as sophisticated information encoding systems while intending merely to record religious beliefs, requires accepting remarkable effectiveness emerged without design. That's possible, but seems less parsimonious than accepting texts may function as designed because they were designed for these purposes. If texts were designed for graduated knowledge revelation, we may approach the stage where the next layer becomes accessible, where technical content remaining embedded but unrecognized becomes interpretable as our capabilities develop, where information surviving through discontinuity periods becomes operational again as we recover ability to understand and use it. What that next layer might contain, what knowledge might be encoded in texts we've read multiple times without recognizing all they preserve, remains unknown. The ancient texts describe cycles of civilizational rise and fall, knowledge gained and lost, advancement and regression. They suggest we're not first to face challenges of managing powerful technologies or developing adequate wisdom to accompany capability. They imply previous cycles provide lessons relevant for our trajectory, if we can extract those lessons from accounts surviving across multiple civilizational discontinuities. Whether those lessons involve merely philosophical insights about wisdom and restraint, or whether they include technical knowledge about monitoring systems and evaluation criteria, or whether they preserve information about entities that may still observe our development, these remain questions investigation continues addressing but hasn't answered. The night holds both questions and silence. The ancient accounts persist in patient preservation, and somewhere between documented history and inherited memory, the possibility remains that navigation of current challenges doesn't occur in complete isolation. The question of what to do with these claims matters more than whether they can be definitively verified. Even without absolute confirmation, the patterns they describe contain warnings about technological development that remain relevant regardless of whether ancient monitoring systems actually exist. The texts identify specific knowledge domains as dangerous when possessed without adequate wisdom: genetic manipulation, creation of non-human intelligence, expansion beyond designated boundaries, understanding of fundamental forces without corresponding understanding of consequences. These are precisely the domains where modern civilization now operates. We've achieved capability to modify human genetics in ways that will persist across generations. We're developing artificial intelligence systems approaching or exceeding human cognitive performance in specific domains. We're beginning permanent human presence beyond Earth's surface. We're manipulating forces at scales that produce consequences we cannot fully predict or control. Whether anyone is watching this development is less important than whether the development itself carries inherent risks that the ancient warnings attempted to identify. The texts suggest that capability without wisdom produces catastrophic outcomes, that power exercised without adequate understanding of consequences leads to disruption requiring external intervention or natural collapse, that civilizations can develop tools they lack maturity to manage responsibly. These warnings remain philosophically valid, even if the monitoring systems that supposedly enforce them don't exist. The dangers are real, whether or not divine oversight makes them additionally concerning. What the Sumerian accounts preserve, beneath all questions about their factual accuracy, is testimony from the world's oldest literate civilization about how they understood their origins and their place in larger orders they believed existed. They saw themselves as created rather than emergent, as receivers rather than inventors, as workers within systems they didn't design. Whether this accurately describes human origins or merely reflects how ancient Mesopotamians made sense of their existence, it reveals assumptions about human nature and human purpose that shaped their civilization. Those assumptions differ profoundly from modern frameworks emphasizing human autonomy, indigenous innovation, and self-determination. We understand ourselves as having built our civilization through our own efforts, as authors of our own destiny, as beings whose capabilities are limited only by what we can discover and create. The Sumerian framework suggests a different possibility, that we operate within constraints we didn't establish, that our capabilities were transmitted rather than independently developed, that our trajectory is observed and potentially managed by systems or entities whose existence we haven't confirmed. The discomfort this possibility creates reveals how deeply committed we are to narratives of human autonomy, the idea that we might not be entirely self-directing, that our civilization might have been established according to designs we didn't originate, that our technology development might trigger responses from oversight systems. These possibilities challenge foundational assumptions about human independence and cosmic isolation. Whether those challenges reflect reality or merely ancient misunderstanding is less important than recognizing that the question deserves consideration. The claims preserved in Sumerian texts cannot be confirmed with available evidence. The King List's impossible chronologies, the Anunnaki's administrative presence, the genetic modification narratives, the surveillance systems, the scheduled returns, none of these can be archaeologically verified. But neither can they be definitively dismissed without explaining why Bronze Age scribes would preserve such specific, consistent, and technically detailed accounts across millennia if they documented nothing real. The conventional explanation treats them as mythology, cultural narratives serving social, political, and religious purposes, rather than historical documentation. This explanation accounts for the text's existence and their preservation without requiring acceptance of extraordinary claims about non-human entities and ancient advanced civilizations. It allows us to appreciate the texts as fascinating cultural artifacts while maintaining that they don't describe actual events. The alternative explanation takes the text more literally, as attempts to document real events, entities, and systems using the limited vocabulary and conceptual frameworks available to ancient scribes. This explanation requires accepting that current understanding of human history and human origins may be incomplete, that advanced knowledge and capabilities existed in periods we consider prehistoric, that entities or civilizations we haven't identified interacted with early human populations in ways that shaped civilizational development. It demands substantial revision of established chronologies and assumptions. Neither explanation can be proven definitively from available evidence. The texts admit both interpretations. The archaeological record neither confirms nor absolutely refutes either framework. We're left with uncertainty, with accounts that are too specific to dismiss, comfortably, but too extraordinary to accept without more evidence than currently exists. The space between those positions is where these claims will remain until investigation produces data conclusive enough to resolve the ambiguity. What we can say with certainty is that the world's oldest bureaucracy preserved claims about non-human administrators with the same precision they used to track grain and silver, that they measured impossible chronologies using mathematical units they applied accurately in every other domain, that they described knowledge transmission with specificity, suggesting actual instruction rather than merely symbolic narrative, that they documented surveillance systems, genetic modifications, and scheduled interventions with procedural detail unusual for purely mythological literature. The tablets sit in museum cases now, pressed clay holding claims we can read but cannot fully evaluate. The evidence they preserve remains suspended between documentation and mythology, between what we can verify and what we wonder about, between silence that might indicate absence and silence that might indicate things we don't yet recognize as speaking. The questions they raise about human origins, human purpose, and human autonomy persist across the 5,000 years since scribes first pressed these accounts into wet clay. Perhaps that persistence is the point. Perhaps the texts were preserved not to provide definitive answers, but to maintain questions each generation must reconsider with new evidence and fresh perspectives, to keep open the possibility that reality is more complex than current frameworks accommodate, to prevent premature closure on mysteries whose resolution may require evidence we don't yet possess or conceptual tools we haven't yet developed. The ancient accounts cannot tell us whether we're observed. They cannot prove that kingship descended from heaven, or that humans were created for labour purposes. They cannot demonstrate that Anunnaki were real entities rather than theological constructs. But they can remind us that civilizations before us asked similar questions about origins and purpose and surveillance, and that those civilizations considered the answers significant enough to preserve across catastrophes, transmissions, and the long silence of centuries when no one could read what had been written. The night deepens toward the hours when thinking becomes clearer and questions feel more pressing. The tablets remain in their cases, holding their silent testimony, and the claims they preserve about beings who descended, about knowledge that was taught, about cycles that repeat, about watching that may continue, persist in the space between what we've proven and what we suspect, waiting for the evidence or the understanding that might finally resolve them into something we can definitively name.